Welcome to the 2-Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%, in which we take a giant book, break it down bit by bit, section by section, talk about it, analyze it, have a good time. I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and this season, our 16th, we are doing 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, and today we are covering the part about Amalfitano, which is the second part of the book, and we're covering it in full because it's essentially like a 70-page novella. I am joined, as always, by Brian Wood, author of Joytime Killbox.
Hello, Chad. Good to be here.
You don't seem as fresh and awake as you do when you're here in the house.
I'm super hungover, but I'm loving life. So let's go.
Let's do this. I feel you, man. I'm not hungover. I'm a little groggy though, and I got a sick kid, and we all have to go in 20 minutes. So this is gonna be short.
Is anybody ever a little hungover, or is it always super hungover?
It's never.
You guys, I barely made it to brunch. I'm not even kidding. It's bad.
Oh my God, you're such a millennial.
And joined also by Katie Whittemore, translator of dozens of books and Bolaño expert.
That's not true.
Somebody who actually works and has a work ethic. Katie.
Yeah, somebody who actually does things and the good one on the podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be here amid the dozens of books that I've translated and all the things I know about Bolaño. So just
perfect.
Bringing the expertise.
Real quick for everyone is that Katie and I did an interview with Emily Hall, the author of The Long Cut and editor at MoMA, and that will occur at the end of the audio version of this podcast. So if you're watching us live, this is going to be a short, but if you're listening to us on the audio, you get a lot of backup about Duchamp, about the artwork on the 3 volumes of the books, about Edward Johns, about a little bit about Edward Johns, and about the ready-made that Amalfitano makes. But we probably won't cover most of those topics since they're covered later on, but instead we can jump right in here since we don't have a ton of time. And I know, Katie, you wanted to talk about his wife and her madness.
Well, I think that this whole section is pretty heavily pointing to madness and sort of introducing madness. You know, if we had voids and if we had pits and if we had the abyss and all of that and violence, now we're bringing in the madness. And I think Amalfitano, we can talk about what the voice that he hears might be or might represent, and if he's mad or if he's not mad. And then of course we have his estranged wife Lola, who goes off the rails and leaves him and abandons their daughter when she's very young to go and basically try to spring a poet from a Basque insane asylum, Mondragon, and take him off to live in France. And so there's just layers and layers of madness. Like Amalfitano is telling us about, we're hearing, or basically, well, the narrator's telling us, but sort of through Amalfitano's vision of his ex-wife, and then her madness, and then the madness of the poet, the supposed madness of the poet that's in the asylum, and some of the other, they're not called inmates. What are they called in English? Patients.
Clients? I was going to say clients, which is maybe
They're not clients. That seems like very current moment to call everybody a client.
Yeah, exactly. The patient is
good customer service. You can always get good customer service at the loony bin.
So you noticed a theme of madness running through this section. Did you notice any other? I want to get through all these, obviously, but Chad, what did you notice that echoed through this?
So the thing I was going to say is, if we want to frame really quick, I'm sure that people who are watching this or listening have read this section, but the quick version, elevator pitch story of it is that Amalfitano, who was the one who helped the critics in part 1 when they got to Santa Teresa, he is a professor of philosophy. His wife Lola leaves him, sends him a bunch of crazy letters where she goes to see this poet, as you mentioned, Katie, and then he moves to Santa Teresa for this job, lives in this kind of weird space at the nicer part of town, but also feels like at the edge of town, given how deserted it is, in the sense that they're surrounded by a fence that has glass shards in the top of it to prevent people from coming in or out. There are lots of murders that are going on in Santa Teresa. He is a bit worried about his daughter. He finds the geometry book he doesn't remember. He hangs it up on the clothesline to let nature commune with it and see if it will learn anything. And then he has an encounter with the dean's son, in which the dean's son takes them out to get mezcal and get their asses kicked, or almost, or attempt to. And then he slowly starts hearing voices in his head and starts going a little bit crazy himself, has a great dream about what humanity is. And that's pretty much the section. The thing that I wanted to pair with what you're asking about, Brian, and what you just talked about, Katie, was that the madness that runs throughout here, I also feel like is sort of the flip side of these people's attempt to understand. That there's a lot of like attempting to understand in here, and that there is like a secret message somewhere, either in the geometry book or like hidden right beneath the surface, where all the hellfire is, where all the pits are, where all the violence is, that once people get close to, they start going a little bit crazy. And so I see those two things as linked. And we were talking for a minute. One of the other books, there's two books in this section, the geometry book that he hangs up on the clothes wire, and then another one that's about the history of the liberator of Chile. It's a real figure. Is it Bernardo O'Higgins? Something like that. O'Higgins is the main. Alex has informed me it's Leonardo, because he is an expert on Chilean history. But the book is about whether O'Higgins was born to was actually like a native Chilean, native Chilean. I don't know what the right terms are. Indigenous, native Chilean, whatever. Indigenous Chilean. I didn't fuck that all up. Did I get there? Anyways, and this particular tribe believed that they had powers of telepathy, and that when they were colonized by the Spanish, the only reason their telepathy stopped, the only reason they didn't win, was because the British or the Spanish killed all of their telepaths. And they had created then other ways of communicating through like branches that move, possibly like smoke signals. Also, they have a language of triangles. And so I see these things as kind of bouncing back and forth between the madness and this like communication. And that might even tie into like, what is Bolaño doing here as an artist trying to communicate the horror of the world? But by doing so, you're essentially sending people into madness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Brian?
Well, yeah, like spinning off of that, I mean, really what are books and what is reading? It's looking at dead trees and hallucinating. You know, I mean, that's, or I'm noticing too, between these first two sections, this desire for connection and loneliness. And the strange, like this oxymoronic way in which by being alone with a text, you can have an intimate connection with something or someone. It's like, so these are kind of neat things that I think maybe he's kind of circling around in this. But in this section, I noticed along with madness and along with geometry, which I try not to think about too often. I also noticed cemeteries popped up quite a bit, ghosts popped up throughout, and then homosexuality is strung through this one as well. So I thought those were really neat things that he toys with in this as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned ghosts, because there's somewhere in part one where I circled and mentioned or wrote a note in the sideline I'm trying to find in the margin that just said ghosts, because I feel like ghosts are going to show up off and on throughout here, and then that felt like a moment where that was like a foreshadowing.
It's interesting that in this section too, like Amalfitano, when he's trying to think about, well, what is the voice? Who is the voice? What could the voice be? And he says, could it be, is it a ghost? And then he says, no, it's not a ghost, but it's probably just a lost soul. And so there's like this difference, this distinction he's drawing between, a regular ghost and then a wandering lost soul that has something to, I guess, do in order to be like free from the wandering, I suppose. With the cemetery, Brian, I noticed that too, and I think we should talk about that. And I think as an extension of the cemetery vision, I think that death is so present in this whole section. Just death, death in general, death, failure, and decadence. Like I think that things here start to feel like stuff really starting to crumble and be in decline. Whether that's the university, whether that's our ability to really have faith in, I think, academic texts. I think there's a real critique. Chad, when you mentioned the book about the I think it's Auracanianos. I don't know in English how they pronounce it, but the indigenous Chilean tribe. And I think like the book is so absurd. When Amalfitano starts breaking it down, he's like, okay, he's a philosophy professor, and I think he's trying to use his like logic, his proofs, you know, and they talk about it being proofs. Like, here's the proof that this person is, you know, who I say he is. And they don't make any sense. And he's like, okay, well, you know, it would follow that. And it's just like all Chileans are telepaths. Like,
Yeah.
you know, so, you know, I think that there's a real, like, sort of almost parodic undercutting of academic knowledge. And then we have on the flip side of that, and this intent to try to order things. And this is something we talk about a lot with Emily in the other interview. But
just real quick though, do you think that like the academic knowledge, do you think that's kind of playing off? I mean, there's something sort of farcical about our quartet in the first section, right?
Yeah.
And do you think this kind of also is another note in that chord?
Yes.
Okay.
I do. I think that there's a critique of the university in this work in general and like sort of academia, but I think it goes beyond just those institutions, and I think it's a critique of possibly of utopia. I mean, I wish we got to go back to all of these things, but you know, if you think about what Latin American intellectuals were doing in the latter half of the 20th century, and there was, you know, the movements, the socialist utopian movements that ended in Latin America in crushing violent repression and dictatorship.
Like 76 in Chile.
Yeah, and in Argentina too. And so, like, you know, there's an interest, I think, in a lot of Bolaño's work, an interest in this generation of Latin American intellectuals and artists who are sort of like in the Latin American tradition, one and the same, right? Because you both write and you write criticism. You both, you know, you're a poet and you're a critic. And I think that what it's pointing to too is that, like, you know, the creation of art and politics were one and the same in those revolutionary movements. Like, an artist was a revolutionary, and there was a commitment, and then there was this failure of those movements and the failure of the utopias, and the flip side of those things was not only dictatorship, but those dictatorships then paved the way for like this like crazy expansion of the global economy and of this late capitalism, which Santa Teresa is like the scene of that. And the crimes that we're starting to get hints of, you know, are the result of those things. So I think that there's a line being drawn throughout like 20th century political failures, failed revolution, failed utopias that lead all to this kind of violence, and that the university, right, or that systems of knowledge are somehow, if not like implicated in that, they are at least completely ill-equipped to deal with it.
Yeah, like can I add to that really quick?
Yeah,
it feels like so going back to what you're saying about the Latin American revolutionaries, there were theorists and writers that were connected to a life, and the university was a spot of resistance. And now the university is not a spot of resistance in Santa Teresa. And the idea of like categorizing, ordering, delimiting, creating knowledge, defining what that knowledge is, has become an act in which, like, if you define what went wrong in Latin America, you essentially spread that evil. I think this is something that we sort of started to touch on with them later on as well, but is that writing about the crimes and like knowing about these things is also making them more prevalent. Like you can't resist the evil that's in the world simply by explaining it. That doesn't stop it. That almost creates more of it. Like, I want you to know that you know, World War II was this bad, and then, you know, that's, so to some people that's like, I don't know that they need to know that was even possible, because they're crazy people. Kyle Rittenhouse, for instance, the hero.
Well, it's interesting to think about this vision of the university when Bolaño was writing in, you know, the early 2000s. And the idea that already then the university was a cemetery. The university was an empty disco, an empty
Oh, my line.
dance floor or whatever, you know? And so at that point, it's already just corrupt and blank. And not a place of resistance, Chad, as you mentioned, and not a place of politics, and not a place of ideals, we could say then too. So already in 2000, that's happening. And then you think about, you think about how far that's even come in the last 20 years to think about, you know, so I guess it's like maybe a distinction between sort of like what the university was supposed to represent and what a neoliberal university is. And because it's really looking at like, well, what is it now potentially, you know, but in the early 2000s, you know, it's so inextricably linked with business and with the market and with making money, and whatever is not profitable gets cut. And we just see that happening now too, but that's been happening for 20 years. The debates about the liberal arts and about having a philosophy department, funding a philosophy department when there are, you know, 3 majors. Sylvie wants to contribute. Okay, go ahead. I'll be right with you. So, oh yeah, we have a comment. But so anyway, I think that's interesting here.
Yeah, man, having been at university since the year 2000, I can tell you that profit centers have become the buzzword for a while. And yeah, hitting a little close to home there, Kate.
Well, yeah.
You know, but yeah, that was going to be my line of the week initially, was the one that you just referenced about the university. I'm going to change it to something else, but specifically, it's the University of Santa Teresa was like a cemetery with only been for thanks in vain. And it was also was like an empty dance club.
Yeah. So
Wonderful.
I know we all have to go. Everybody has their kids in the background. I can hear yours, and mine's like, I have to go to the bathroom. So,
for juice.
I'll be right with you. But there's we're not going to have time to go through like some of the really great stuff. I wonder if, you know, if we should propose, you know, we keep reading, but maybe there's a couple ideas that we can circle back to, or even report on our own.
We don't have to be like super strict.
Nobody's
cares.
Nobody's like going on your pages. Well, there's two things that I think we're going to want to talk about, and then I would propose that you guys think about, because I'd like to know your thoughts. Is that okay? Can I give you this task? Okay. So one is the idea of in this section, the introduction of politics through a couple of different ways, and specifically socialism, Marxism. Okay, so talking a little bit about Chile and about Chile, he sort of, you know, gives some good jabs at Chilean society, but then, you know, the dream that that Amalfitano ends with Yeltsin, and the idea of like, well, what is life? Like, basically, it's like, I'm going to tell you the secret to life. I'm going to tell you what the third leg of the human chair is, and it's supply
plus demand plus magic.
Plus magic.
It is.
So
I don't have time to run my full joke, but there's a Billie Eilish Ocular VR concert that I believe is supply plus demand plus magic. Yeah, I saw this video kind of out of it on Hulu. Like, what the fuck am I watching? But really, I'll link to it. You should watch it, because basically what it shows is the concert of Billie Eilish in which people are playing a video game as they dance to her songs, slicing up random creations. Like, it's like literally like a VR world concert. It's very bizarre. It is filled with magic. Okay,
and supply and demand. It sounds.
And supply. There's one Billie Eilish. There's a lot of demand, so they made a VR concert app.
Are there Dionysian mists?
There is a very heavy Dionysian vibe. Yes,
because that's important here.
There is. No. It's this commercial is this thing just like made into something shitty and horrible at late capitalist moment.
Oh my God.
You need to have a lot of mezcal to get dreams like this, I think.
Yeah,
yeah, you do.
the real shit.
We should try this. I think you're calling for an experiment.
Ooh.
The one thing I want to point out, there's two things I want to point out that aren't thoughtful like Katie recommendations. But one is that I love that when she writes him the letter, Lola writes him the letter, and one of the first letters that is printed in here and he's going, and it's like sort of makes sense, and then she's like, Emma is a lesbian. Every day, hundreds of thousands of cows are sacrificed. Every day, a herd of herbivores or several herds cross the valley from north to south, so slowly but so fast it makes me sick. Right now. Do you understand, Oscar? No, thought Amalfitano, I don't. What happened in the last chapter where like he gives his speech about on the stage and the pit?
I don't know a word you're speaking about. Yeah.
I don't know what you just said.
I don't know either. And then there's a reference to boxing, which I think is a hook for anyone who is reading this for the first time. They talk about his dad and the boxing. And the final thing that I thought was interesting that I named this after, and that I'd like to come back to, this is one to think about later, is the reference in the middle here called that says he remembered, but fleetingly as one remembers a lightning bolt, Ramon Llull and his fantastic machine, fantastic in its uselessness. And that struck me because the Ramon Llull Institute is what funds all our Catalan books. Ramon Llull is a Catalan poet. I didn't know what this was, so I looked it up, and it's essentially like a crazy ass drawing of what would be like a computer, like a way of like calculating things. It was like a machine to calculate things, which ties in the geometry of this, and it is some connection between like the physical sciences and the poetry side of things, and like what that balance is. So I think that that's something that I'd like to come back to in a future episode if we have time. But it stood out to me just solely because that didn't,
because Ramon Llull
and like machine words I see together. Ryan, you got anything you want to leave with?
No, I just had a good time. This was a kind of it felt like a strange aside of a section, but it connects perfectly with a lot of the themes and echoes that we've had from the first section.
And it takes place before the first section.
Yeah.
Because the critics see the book hanging in the backyard.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
So
I think that we are going to want to go back also to what I think is like a central quote for the whole book, which is on my page 227. And it's when Amalfitano is thinking about, the sad paradox of the erudite, the learned pharmacist.
Yes.
Okay, and he's talking about like the works that people choose to engage with, like the Metamorphosis or Bartleby or A Christmas Carol, right? And he says, "What a sad paradox," thought Amalfitano. "Now even bookish pharmacists are afraid to take on the great, imperfect, torrential works, books that blaze paths into the unknown. They choose the perfect exercises of the great masters, or what amounts to the same thing. They want to watch the great masters spar, but they have no interest in real combat. When the great masters struggle against that something that terrifies us all, that something that cows us and spurs us on amid blood and mortal wounds and stench." And so I would like, my question for you guys, and anybody who wants to put anything in the chat, is what is that something? Okay, in Spanish, it's aquello, right? So aquello, we're talking about, it's a noun. What is that thing that the great masters are doing combat with in these grand, imperfect, torrential works? And I think there's lots of different ways that we can conceive of that something. And I'm curious about people's opinions on that. And then my sentence was, I think for all the sadness and all the sort of like pitiful sort of failures of Amalfitano, I think the saddest thing about him is his lunch of boiled chicken in the university cafeteria. Now, if that's not a failed intellectual.
Having had chicken at the university cafeteria yesterday, I will admit that is an abyss.
Is it definitely? But was it boiled? Because it's the boiledness.
No, it wasn't.
That was the problem for me.
I'm sure that that's a possible ordering thing in the University of Rochester's realm of fine dining.
I'm going to ask. That's what I want to ask Natasha Wimmer when we talk to her. Natasha, in the original, it says this. Like, how did you choose boiled as the description for the chicken? Was it not poached? Could it not have been the boiled chicken?
That's so funny. We do have some responses real quick, and then we'll have to go from the people watching in response to your idea of the something from the void, the abyss, trying to impose European ideas of order on the craziness of actual life, which is interesting, which is something we talk about. And from our future guest, Emily Hall, mentions that favorite line is, all he saw was a dog heading calmly towards Avenida Madero to the bus stop.
Yeah. It's fine. It's like nothing, there's nothing to see here. Everything's fine in Santa Teresa.
It's all good. There was one other line I really liked, but I can't find it now, about poetry.
On 226?
Yeah, 226. Yeah. And now all I read is poetry. Poetry is the one thing that isn't contaminated, the one thing that isn't part of the game. I don't know if you follow me, Professor. Only poetry, and let me be clear, only some of it is good for you. Only poetry isn't shit.
Yeah.
And nobody reads poetry.
Everybody just...
This is the degradation that we have.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sorry. I am being summoned. I'm gonna have to run.
I have to go to a doctor's appointment.
I have to bring the kids back to school.
All of us with these kids. So everyone who is watching this, please download the audio and listen to the additional part. I think you'll very much enjoy it.
I should just say that whatever happened today, however interesting or entertaining anyone found it, the conversation with Emily Hall is thrice that. It's really great. Emily's amazing, and she's a genius, and she gives a ton of great information about some of the art references.
It's really interesting, especially to sell this a little bit more. It picks up on the thread of like the organization, the idea of knowledge, and that's come up here at the end and that we touched upon. But yeah, so if you're watching, please rate, review, do all the fun things, tell your friends to listen, tell them to download, and we will be back next week with the first half of the next part, which is the part about fate.
Dun, dun, dun.
See y'all next week.